Welcome to Closer to Venus. I'm Johnny Burke. Our guests today are Dr. Dave Bettenhausen and Carla Bogni Kidd, co-authors of The Gift of Past Lives with Mother, Isabella, God, and Elizabeth. They have an incredible story about how they shared several past lives together. Dave and Carla, welcome Closer to Venus. Thanks for joining.
Hello.
It's a pleasure, Johnny. Good to meet you.
The book has an amazing title, and we're obviously going to get to that at one point. But the first question I would have for both of you is, what led you to this path?
Well, back in 2014, I worked for Dave. I was his office manager, and we had implemented electronic medical records. It was awful. We're not 29, and we were used to a chart, pen and paper, and everything was going computerized. So it was really stressful. And Dave was working very long days. He normally is a cross between Yogi Bear and, like Fred Flintstone. And he was just cranky. I mean, I couldn't talk to him. We had been friends forever. He was just not approachable. So one day, in a very unlikely publication, I was reading AARP magazine, and I saw an article on meditating. And I had meditated years earlier. I have a Catholic upbringing, but I stopped meditating because it scared me, because of what the church said about it. You could conjure up things that you don't want. But I had kind of gotten past all that. And I took the magazine into the office and I said to Dave, we have one or two options here. I can either call a counselor for you, or we could try meditation. We could try it as an office. So Dave said, well, let's try to meditate. So the other two office girls and myself decided that we would meditate. We did that all together for the first 2 days. And on the third day, it was just Dave and I, and he came up to me afterwards and said, I know you're going to think this is weird, but I was talking to your mother. It took us a whole day and then many days afterwards to explain everything, to get Dave past the feeling that he was cracking up. He apparently has a really connected gift to the spiritual world. He met my mother first, who had died 20 years before. Then he met his spirit guide, Isabella. Then we met my spirit guide, Elizabeth. And somewhere along the way in there, while we were asking many, many questions and documenting and journaling everything we were told, Dave had a conversation with God. And that sent us on our journey for the past 6 years now, and to write 2 books now, 2 more out shortly. And it's really to get our message out. And not just the message that there is reincarnation. We have 5 simple rules of learning if we want to make it through this life, and those are included in our book, the first book, along with 21 of our past lives out of the 29. And after each one of those 21 stories, we actually give the reason that we had to reincarnate again, what we didn't learn and why we came back.
It almost sounds like going to school, where you have to just keep going and keep taking courses, or maybe even go to graduate school. Meditation really does seem to be a portal. It opens up that opportunity. Maybe you cross through, or you pierce the veil, and it opens up the past lives and past life regression sessions and so on. But isn't it interesting how the church warns against these things? Is it just me, or is that just something that's like incredibly outdated?
Well, this is something that it even goes all the way back to the 11, 12, 13, 1400s. There was a movement within even the Catholic Church called Molinism back then. The church outlawed it because people were meditating, and the church was concerned that if you could reach God individually, there would be no reason for the church.
Or confession.
So that's,
or confession.
Right, any of those things. So if you could reach God yourself, you don't need the church. Now, we still think church is okay, and people get a lot of fellowship that way. However, you don't need church to reach God, or you don't need church to reach these experiences. It really started our first little experience while we were meditating. I had a memory from 1962 when I was 3 years old. I started to share the memory with Carla and Paula, who worked in the office. I was raised in Nebraska. They were raised in Boston. And I told them in 1962, my dad went to graduate school in Boston. And they didn't know that I'd ever been to Boston. So I was telling them about this experience where I was running on the beach, and I had never seen a beach, and there were Ferris wheels and roller coasters in the background. I was running, and then this little girl pushed me down, yelled at me, told me to quit bothering her family. I was too noisy because I was going and running. And I told Carla, this little girl had this little 2-piece blue ruffled bathing suit and had a little pot belly. And Carla looked at me and said, Dave, it was me.
And I didn't need meditation to remember that because we were raised Catholic. We had, 5 girls. I was the youngest. The parents were always splitting up and getting back together because, of course, the church didn't allow divorce. So this particular day, we were all together, all 7 of us. We didn't have money. My father had got 2 cabs for us. We went to Revere Beach, and Revere Beach wasn't just a beach. It had an amusement park with it. So you can imagine when Dave started to talk about this amusement park and a beach, Paula is also my sister who worked in the office. We knew exactly what he was talking about. And then as he told the story, we both got chills up our back because the day we arrived at that beach, I didn't have a bathing suit. We had to walk across the street to one of those little souvenir shops. My parents were not wealthy. We didn't have the money, but they bought me a bathing suit. For whatever reason, I didn't have mine. And it was my first 2-piece blue ruffled bathing suit. And that memory stuck with me forever. My family was together. I had a new bathing suit. So when Dave had this memory, I knew it was legit. Couldn't possibly have known that. In fact, Paul and I both simultaneously said, when did you live in Boston? We didn't even know it. 20 years of working with him and we didn't even know it. So it was really an aha moment.
And speaking of aha moments, the meditation, is that how you discovered your past lives together?
Correct.
Right.
That's correct.
Yes. Spontaneous memories.
It's amazing. And you've had 29 past lives together?
Yes.
That's correct.
I'm dying to know this. How far back to the very first life you shared?
Our first life together was over 6,000 years ago.
And what, if I may ask, what location, what culture was that?
It's actually, I would say, a Hebrew, Middle Eastern. We actually found that life born on the Mount of Olives, no less.
Mm-hmm.
And I did some research, and there's actually an ancient civilization. They found the ruins on the Mount of Olives that's dated somewhere between 7,000 and 6,000 years ago. When we learned of that story, we felt unusual compared to other people. We were drawn together. What we found is we traveled along the Dead Sea and settled in the area called the Ayan Gedi, which I had never really heard of either until we did the research and found that there's actually an oasis kind of space there where there's vegetation, rivers, waterfalls right close to the Dead Sea, which would be a perfect place to set up a settlement.
Incredible. That was about 6,000 years ago. It seems that both of you have experienced what I believe is called lives between lives, where I believe you enter into a soul contract, as Carl had mentioned earlier, where you learn, or you discover, should I say, that there's so much more to learn, so you have to go back and agree to enter into a certain body for a certain purpose. That in-between space, if you can remember, what was it like?
Sure. I have a few that I can share. The experience is very interesting. You sort of create the experience because you really, as you're transitioning, it becomes very confusing. You no longer have physical senses. So it's not exactly like you see, hear, touch, feel, because those are really physical senses that we have in this physical life. And between those first 3 days or so, it's very confusing because you don't really understand how to speak, listen, hear, and then you start to experience and you start creating something you can understand. So, or at least it feels as if you experience that you're sitting in a room, a relatively large room. I describe it as feeling like you're in a courtroom and you're the witness. There is a council around you of 12 that we found out have all completed their path on earth, and they're trying to help and guide you. They actually run you through your past life and some of your other past lives, explaining what you've done wrong and what lessons that you needed to learn. There starts to become a plan. God and counsel and your spirit guide are involved in the plan and telling you what lessons you need to learn.
Dave, tell him what counsel is and your spirit guide.
Is that the Council of Elders that you are referring to, the Council of 12?
Yes, I believe it's the Council of Elders, as other people talk about.
Exactly.
They introduced themselves as the council. They didn't really say elders. They just were introduced as the council. You literally, it appears that you're watching movies of your lives. There are times during the movie where you may not have treated someone with love and respect, and then actually you experience that sensation that they felt. If you were disrespectful to them, you feel the same disrespect that they felt.
Great.
It's tied into some of that karma and learning compassion. So you keep having that experience. They tell you, certainly you need to potentially have a life with this person because you have karma to fix. You were not respectful or you've hurt them, or they've hurt you or controlled you, and you need to interact with them again. You start to learn those people in your life that you've had many lives with, and they're closest to you. They actually explained this sort of as a grid. Everyone is connected, but there are those within the grid that are closest to you, and you will follow through with them again in other lives. We call those people your soul group, soul family, family mates. Some of those people you have karma with, so we call them karmic mate, because you literally need to return with them again. Otherwise, you can't fix the problem that you had with them last time. At the end of this, you get a few choices. We talk about these in our upcoming book. You get some choices on archetype. Your personality follows you, but there's some other controlling interests that you get to choose. Try to recommend what you choose. If you don't choose what they do, it has a little karmic ties to it because you're letting your ego make this choice. However, your life is sort of planned out, and you go to a resting place we call the pod, but it's part of the entire grid where you wait until the events that need to happen so it lines up for you occur, and then you reincarnate into your next life.
That's the first time I've heard a reference to that resting or that way station, if you will, as the pod. It's interesting. So what determines how long you stay in the pod? It's almost like a basketball player going back to the bench because he took too many shots.
Exactly.
Coach says, back to the bench until you learn your lesson that when you go out there, you have to play defense too. So I guess when we get to that place, where we're in between lives, I can't just say, I got it, I'm cool. Next life, I want to be LeBron James.
You don't get those choices.
We wish.
People a lot of times ask the question, or they've made this statement, you get to choose your parents. And my answer to that is always, what if your parents don't choose you? Who gets to make the choice?
Very interesting.
It's guided by counsel. It's guided by God. It's guided by your spirit guide and angels, because everybody doesn't get to make their personal choice.
Or would all be multimillionaires with the perfect health and a wonderful life.
Complete with supermodels for everyone. Yes, of course.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely.
And of course, but that's not always going to give you the spiritual growth that you yearn for now, is it?
No, it's not.
Yeah.
That's right. Growth comes through adversity.
That would make a lot of sense to me. Carla, you had mentioned that Dave had a conversation with God. Either one of you can answer this, but that conversation, what was it like? Did God reveal himself in a human visage, or was it telepathic? What was it like?
Let me first say that it's not unusual for God to talk to people. If you are on any of the reincarnation sites, there are many people that say they have spoken with God and Jesus. It's very believable. It's those who are afraid to believe it can happen and their ears are closed, their eyes are shut, that say that it's impossible. Why would God stop talking to us after the Old Testament just because? It doesn't make any sense. So I'm a question asker. I have a wandering mind. I ask Dave everything. And through all of our journaling, I said to him this, that, and the other thing. And, what about this? What about that? And one day when Dave was meditating, he actually asked his spirit guide, Isabella, who is God? And Dave, tell him what happened.
The next words I heard or felt, because I don't say heard, and sometimes you have to kind of interpret it because it doesn't come across as easy to understand English all the time. Mm-hmm. It's a feeling. But I immediately heard, I am. We've had lessons from God where God has told us he is both male and female. Why would God be anything else?
Right.
Woohoo!
Complete in every way. Actually, in our third book that will come out, relatively long quote from God, because God wanted to express some thoughts on why we exist as far as and why life exists. And it's sort of in that the words come out and we tried to put them down as verbatim as we can. Sort of, I exist and others exist because love needs to exist kind of quotes, and face adversity and have free will, because without adversity and free will, you cannot grow. And without free will, you cannot choose to love. Those kind of statements.
That's amazing. These are the type of principles that I think everyone needs to know. I don't want to take the position of criticizing the church. I think it's a good place to start, but at the same time, and I've heard this from people from different religious backgrounds that want to find the truth and want to dig a little bit deeper, will often tell me that religion often gets in the way. Do you find
Yes,
that
I agree.
Absolutely. Religion works to put us in a little box.
it's a tough nut to crack, that box, because when sometimes we have discussions with people that do want to deepen their spirituality and they want to reach higher ground, but they are limited by that box. And I've had this happen several times where I'll start talking about these kind of topics about reincarnation, past lives, and so on. And I'll often hear, oh, that's not in the Bible. Oh, that's not in the Bible either. And it gets to the point where you feel like you're literally running into a brick wall.
Yes.
And Johnny, some of this is in our second book, Hell No Reincarnation, but I was raised Catholic like Carla was, and
Like all of us.
we tried to go,
Yes.
we tried to reconcile some of that in that book. Part of it is going back and looking at history and looking at facts. 33% of the world's population actually believes in reincarnation. If you ask Christians, 20%, and you look at the stories in the Bible, there are at least mentions that seem to support that somebody's spirit was here before and now they're here again. If you start to look at church history, which we did to put in a little bit in this book, Origen, who was a principal writer early on in Christian literature, really promoted up into 200 AD reincarnation. And the church actually, at 200 years after he died, excommunicated him from the church because reincarnation was part of his teaching. You start to look at those things, you realize that reincarnation didn't just disappear. It was sort of systemically written out.
Right. Expunged.
Yes.
Picture a table. There's a pile of books to my right, and there's
Yes.
a pile of books to my left. And I thought, oh, I don't really want this. Get rid of those, and we'll just keep these. And that leads to the obvious question of, well, what else did they leave out? When I was little, for what it's worth, I used to always ask, I went to CCD in addition to going
Us
to
too.
church. And we would ask questions about reincarnation. We'd get anything from a blank stare to a dirty look. They just wouldn't answer the question.
You
which I
just
thought,
have to have faith and believe.
Right.
That's what I was told. You just
Yeah.
have to have faith and believe. Sorry, my mind does double time.
And Johnny, one of the lessons we learned early on is that if you consider God to be love and loving, would you get one chance to get it right? Since God knows everything, he knows who's going to fail. I've heard Christian groups talk about this, that you're given free will. God knows giving you free will, you're going to fail. And so he or she created you anyway, knowing you would fail and go forever to hell.
I think it's
Isn't that the
retarded.
story?
Yeah, I think I actually
Yeah.
said that to one of my mom's friends, when I was like 8 years old. Because I used to talk about this stuff even when I was little. And one of her friends, she wasn't a nun, but she was a very strict and stern woman. And she just looked at me as if to say, children should be seen and not heard. But even that something's off with this. So
We actually do we did a little YouTube video. It's on our website about hell. And what we say in the little skit is actually, it's all factual, how people came to believe in hell, where it came from.
that's probably a topic for another day. But since you brought it up, there are people, quite a few, that have had what they call a dark NDE, a dark, unpleasant near-death experience where some of them literally felt like they were in hell. So do either one of you have any insight? Is it something created in the mind? What exactly is that?
Well, just like I was telling you before, Johnny, when you're in the spirit world and we try to make it as physical as you can, that's how our mind works. We carry this human existence to that world. If you're shown a past life experience where you've been horrible and you may have hurt somebody, you were part of a, let's say, war, and so you killed multiple people, and then you experience how their families felt when they lost them, you're going to experience some agony to learn compassion. Does that make sense? You may have actually experienced being in a fire. As you're experiencing being in a fire in your past life review, if you set the fire yourself, you may feel the agony for the people who lost the building or other people who lost their life if you set a fire.
And during those 3 days of acclimating, as Dave said before, you're losing your senses and your mind is trying to fill in what you believe. And people who are raised with fear with religion, you believe in the devil, you believe in hell and all of those things. During those 3 days, it's easy for you to fill in and think that that's what's happening.
Okay. Well, it does make sense where if it's true that as a form of karmic payback, if you've inflicted pain on someone, that it's only just that you get to experience what that person felt. So I would imagine someone like Adolf Hitler probably had a fairly lengthy stay in that space, but it's not forever. Is he perhaps offered, or someone like him who's done some absolutely heinous, horrible things, are they offered a chance to redeem themselves?
Everybody is.
Everybody is. That's why I found 42 past lives. If you look at these things, that you find some patterns, and the patterns are interesting. We found patterns where I was English fighting the Scottish, and the next life I'm Scottish fighting the English, and you realize you're actually fighting the opposite side. You're always fighting yourself. You find that you've been a slave owner and you've been a slave, because in some way you have to understand both sides. I've never had the experience of being a female. In past life regression, you find people who have had both lives as male and female. Again, if you haven't lived both sides, how can you truly understand? And there is some karmic issues related to that. We find, especially for women, throughout history, they've been suppressed. So you find a lot of women coming through, again, having to face karma from the same people that oppressed them in their last life, because to overcome the oppression is part of the lessons.
So I'm sure you probably get this question a lot. How can we find out who we most likely had past lives with before in our circle, friends, family, that type of thing?
Well, the first answer is probably everyone. Okay. That's the first thing to tell you. I'll tell you a couple little lessons. One of the little lessons was one time that Isabella was trying to tell us was, remember when you go in to see the store clerk and you know the store clerk's having a bad day and they're really rude and you become rude back? Just imagine that person now has a karmic debt with you, and you've now tied yourself potentially to that store clerk for the next few years, lives, whatever. You may still be able to correct it. You may start to be nice to other store clerks. Those store clerks may interact with their spouses. Their spouses are nice to some other spouse, and that spouse goes home and is really nice to his wife, who happens to be the store clerk, and it fixes the problem. Okay. He says, oh, I understand my wife has had bad days while she's a store clerk. And he tries to make it really nice for her. It may be that you fixed it before the next life. But if you didn't, you're probably tied to that store clerk just because you decided that you needed to respond.
And it's all about your intentions.
How does that relate to, I hear quite a bit about the wheel of karma, and then there's also the concept of the wheel of grace. I'm not sure if I got this right or not, but the wheel of karma, you don't really go anywhere. You just keep going around and around. But if you stop and you get off that wheel of where you have to always punch someone back that punched you, yell at someone that yelled you, and you step away and you just walk away from it, you take the high road. Does that have anything to do with attempting to get on the wheel of grace, or is that something completely different?
Johnny, I have never heard it called the Wheel of Grace, but I will tell you, if I showed you some of the pictures from our second book, you would see the Wheel of Karma. You would see angels related to specific karma. And you would see also in that book that we talk about grace, because the reality is grace is love.
Right.
And the wheel of karma is conceit, selfishness, jealousy, and unforgiveness. If you respond as conceited, you're not responding with love. If you're responding as a jealous person, you're not responding with love. Those are those 5 simple rules that we talk about. And every time you choose to make a decision out of love, you're making a decision that removes you from karma.
So let's say a kid is walking home from school and 2 or 3 of the bully kids take his money, beat him up, whatever. And the kid he walks away because he figures there's no point. He's not big enough to beat up the other kids. And besides that, he feels that it's not going to accomplish anything. Is that an example of taking the high road, or?
Yes.
That would really be the high road, making the decision to not retaliate. Retaliation really implies that you think you get to judge and you become judge and jury. The retaliation, the judgment, etc., really belongs to God and the karmic wheel.
However, you cannot be owned, so you have to find a way to avoid that situation so it doesn't happen again, because if you allow it again, then you're being owned. And ownership falls under conceit, because that means you're too lazy. You think you're too special to do anything about it.
Really? Okay.
Hmm.
Never really looked at it that way.
Neither did we until we were taught those 5 simple rules that we put into the first book. Conceit is not just looking in the mirror and saying, oh, I look good. There's so
Mhm.
much more to it.
And the same is true for selfishness. In the world we live in, if you don't take care of yourself, example, if you smoke too much and you get lung cancer someday, you're really being selfish. You're taking the reward of smoking and you're being selfish because you're letting someone else take care of you someday because you're not being your best self.
The angels, or the spirit guides that you spoke of, I imagine that would be Isabella and Elizabeth. Did you choose them or did they choose you?
That's an interesting question.
That's also in book 3.
Yeah, they were created in the beginning specifically with you and some of your soul group involved. So Isabella's literally been my spirit guide for 6,000 years. She has been the spirit guide for others when I was not present in the physical world.
And they do not have gender. So they will offer you a name. If you feel better talking to a male spirit guide, then you get a male name. If you feel better speaking with a female spirit guide, then you get a female name. Mine's Elizabeth, or it would have been, I think, Elijah. Elijah or Elizabeth.
Dave, you had mentioned some allusions in the Bible to reincarnation. One quote I do remember, you know exactly what I'm going to say. Do you not recognize me as Elijah?
Mm-hmm.
I'm no Bible scholar, but even I remember that one. And I remember reading that when I was young and thinking, that's...
John the Baptist was Elijah. Yes.
It was John the Baptist.
Yes.
Right. I'm really conflicted about this because there's things I like about church, principles I like, but there's things that don't make sense or that were edited. I think you reach the end of that road very quickly.
Yes, Johnny, part of this is the way we like to look at it, and even Isabella has tried to explain it. The Bible has a lot of really good information.
I agree.
Some of it's even very factual. Some of the lessons are really excellent. However, it's also part of the longest phone game of all time. Okay? You're talking about a story of Adam and Eve that is 6,000 years ago that was told as an oral tradition for at least 3,000 years before any form of writing even became. Then you're talking about a story that is probably not particularly accurate.
Right. If you took two guitar players, one plugged straight into the amp and the other one had 57 different effects pedals plugged into another amp, it wouldn't even sound like a guitar anymore. And I like to use
very good
analogies, which are kind of goofy to some people, but at the same time, it makes a lot of sense because it creates a lot of distortion, deliberate
Correct.
or otherwise.
Yes.
And it doesn't have to be even necessarily that it was deliberate. But if you look at even New Testament, there's a lot of stories in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they changed it, and they're not compatible.
That's right.
They're not compatible. One story right after the crucifixion says, all the apostles stayed in Jerusalem. And one of the stories says all the apostles immediately went to Galilee. Now, both of those things couldn't happen. They couldn't both immediately stay in Jerusalem and immediately stay in Galilee. One of the stories is wrong. We're told that it's infallible. Well, it can't be infallible if one of the two stories is wrong.
Right. There's probably several instances of what would be called today as destructive editing. You can't really get it back. Once you cut that book out or that chapter, then there's a lot of pieces that don't fit together.
Missing.
If we want to find our angels, our spirit guide, as you describe them, how do we do that?
Carla, explain a little bit about the karmic wheel.
Sometimes you have one set angel, but you always have other angels that come to you through your lives. If in a life you had a tendency towards conceit, for instance, then you might be given let's put it this way. God decides your astrological sign. Mm-hmm. The astrological signs are broken down into 4 sets of 3. So for instance, if you're an Aquarian, a Pisces, or an Aries, you all have the yellow angel of selfishness. Now, selfishness just doesn't mean that you only think of yourself like you take the biggest piece of cake. It means that maybe you weren't giving of your time, and that falls under selfishness. So with each one of the astrological signs, there's an angel and a color related to it. The selfishness angel happens to be yellow. The jealousy angel happens to be green. So when you meditate, if you're meditating religiously, what often happens after you get past the point of being able to shut your mind off, which you never do completely, but you get to a point where you get into that zone, you may see blobs of colors. And those blobs of colors are indeed your angel. And you might see a green angel. And it doesn't necessarily mean you're jealous in this life. It means that you had the tendency to be jealous in your past life. God has provided you with that angel this time to make sure you overcome it this time. So with each one, you could have another angel, but you should stick with your astrological sign and with that color and know that that is one of the things that you need to overcome. Certainly, if you're meditating and you see lots of colors, then you better start paying attention because that means you've got a lot of things to work through. Our book called The Manual, which we're releasing in the next few months, that actually talks about your angels and your spirit guides.
The colors that you mentioned reminds me of what I read in the work of Dr. Michael Newton. I believe it was Journey of Souls, where he talked about colors.
Journey of Souls, yep.
Which I think was the first one. Really interesting stuff. Guys, I'd like to really thank you for joining us today. The material is incredible. I want to put your website and the titles of your books in the show notes as well. How do our listeners find you online?
Our website is thegiftofpastlives.com.
And do you have Facebook groups as well, or is